Alright, hey everybody. I'm going to teach you how to play Denizens the Hero War. This is an 18 card, 1 to 2 player, asymmetric card game in which you are competing over different theaters for victory points. It's what I would call a column fighter, like if you're familiar with games like Air, Land, and Sea or War of the Ring, the card game, you're going to be using the cards from your faction and playing them strategically out into different theaters as they come up in order to win victory points from the primary theater or deck or position building effects from winning the secondary theater. It's 18 cards, they all have a common back, and they all have the same type of multi-use front, and I will introduce these different elements as we explain the rules. But just as far as components, you get 18 cards, and then there are going to be some number of reference cards. There's a decent number of keywords, and then there's a round reference and an icon reference. So I won't go through these, but we are going to be using this card in particular as I help walk you through the rules. So I'm going to keep that handy. These are the strength tracking shards. These are going to help us when we're tracking how much strength each faction has in a theater, but I will get to that as well. Let's go through setup, and I'll introduce other concepts as you go. But in order to win the game, you need to be the first player to get to 5 points, or if you both get to 5 points in the same round, it's whoever has the most points, and I'll go through the tie-breaking process if it should get that far. Or you can also lose. You can't. This is a game where it's possible to win, and it's also possible to be the person who didn't lose, which is the same thing as winning. So if one player gets down to fewer than 3 cards in their deck, then it's what's called a morale loss. Your forces just give up because they see no possible path to victory, and so they stop fighting. So if you get to fewer than 3 cards, so that's one way to win, is you can whittle your opponent down and steal enough cards that they are going to lose due to morale. All the cards have this common back, and you can see there are 2 factions in the game, and they each have their own icon. This is the River-Wide Alliance. They are essentially the good guys. They have that burning tree icon, and then this helmet icon is the Nulgador faction. They are essentially the bad guys. What you're going to do at setup is you'll notice that one half of these cards is going to have this little circular sun icon, and the other half of the card isn't. This indicates that this is the starting half of the card. So first thing you want to do is orient all the cards to their starting halves, and then give each player their faction. So pick who's going to play as the red Nulgador faction, and the blue River-Wide Alliance faction. Now you can tell which faction a card belongs to based on its color, but also the name of the card is right there, and it has the faction icon, and same for right here. So orient them all to the starting half, and then give each player their 9 cards. I'm going to set up as if the 2 players are sitting side by side, but you can also you can set this up however you want. You can set it up so that you're sitting across from each other as well. But for the purposes of getting everything in camera, we're going to do this. So go ahead, and each player is going to shuffle their deck. And you can see based on the card backs, when the cards are oriented to the Nulgador half, that icon is up, and then opposite obviously for the River-Wide half of the card. Okay, so here's our starting deck. Each player at setup is going to draw 3 cards into their hand. I'm going to put these face up right here, but that's only for convenience so that I can remember what's what here. These are going to be in your hand, and these are going to be secret from your opponent, so you don't have to show those to your opponent, but I'm just going to leave those sitting out right there for the purposes of showing you what's going on. So each player has drawn 3 cards. First, the Riverwide player is going to pick the first primary location. So there's a few elements on these cards. Every single card has, in this square here, a character, or this is actually simply referred to as the card. So there is a Riverwide character, a blue character, a Riverwide location. The location is just that top left rectangle there. And then on the other half, there's exactly the opposite for the Nulgador, or the red faction. There's a red character and a red location. So for now, just look at your cards at the locations, and let's say we pick this location as to set up as the starting. I'm going to slide these down so we have more room on camera here. I'm going to set this as the starting primary theater over here, just right of center of the table. And then after that happens, the Nulgador, the red player, is going to pick the starting secondary theater. And that's going to go over here. And so when a card is played as a location, it's played out horizontally, and you're referencing the top left portion of the card. When a card is out here on the table as a location, ignore everything else about the card. You're only looking at this part up here. And I'm not sure if my camera is getting everything for you, but I'll try to adjust it there. Okay. Now we've done that, go ahead and fill your hand so that you have 5 cards in your initial hand. So that would mean drawing 3 more cards because you chose one of your first 3 cards to put out as a location. So now we each have 5 cards in our hand. Again, these are kept secret from your opponent. And you're actually ready to begin. So in terms of play areas, each player is going to have a deck, a discard pile, which I kind of, to save space on small tables, I've been putting the discard pile underneath my deck. But you can put your discard pile wherever you want as long as you know where things are for you. Your discard pile is placed in a stack face up. You're going to need to have room up here to play cards onto these theaters. You're going to need 1 designated space for where the primary theater goes, and then 1 designated space where the secondary theater goes, and then just leave a little bit of space over here because you're going to be doing what's called loading a theater into the game. And loaded theaters are essentially the next location on a, call it a conveyor belt, that's going to keep moving this way. So you're going to be introducing new locations in, and some locations are going to get claimed as you go. We're all set up. In the first round of the game, the Nulgador player is going to take the first turn of the game. Thematically, it's as if the Nulgador faction are the aggressors, and so they're taking that first attack on the first Riverwide location. So I'm going to go ahead and grab our reference card here. First phase of the game, so there's 3 main phases in every round. You're going to keep going round after round until one player wins, or like I said, a player could lose. So we're going to start the first round of the game with the conflict phase, or every round has a conflict phase. You're going to take turns until a player disengages during the conflict phase. You're going to take turns taking actions. So on your turn, the available actions are 1, play a card, 2, use a card's action, or 3, disengage. So let's go through those in order. Playing a card is exactly what it sounds like. You're going to choose a card from your hand to play into a theater. I like to set it up so that the Nulgador player is playing the card kind of on the right half of the location card, and then the Riverwide Alliance player is playing cards on the left half. And then if you play additional cards, you just start creating your column of your faction. And so each faction could theoretically have a column of cards in each theater. But playing a card is as easy as pick your card and play it into one of the two theaters. And that's your turn. And then the other player would go. And most often this is what you're doing. Most turns you're going to spend your action just playing a new card into a given theater. I would also right away update with your strength tracking chit to note what your strength is. So that doesn't necessarily make sense to you yet, so let's go ahead and go over that. We'll take a look at the cards here. There's a few elements on the character portion of the card. Again, most of the time this is just referenced by other effects as the card, because that's what you're concerned about, unless the card is a location currently. So there's just an image on the top left. This diamond portion is the card's attack value. The circular portion is the card's defense value. This could be 0 or just have a dash in it. A dash means 0. This is the card's type right here. This one's an army. There are 3 different types. There's army, commander, and hero. And then every card has an effect that is just written in the text box here. If there's not a bolded word in front of the text, it just means it's an ongoing effect. It's usually some condition or modifier that you have to account for, or like, for instance, this one says, if you have exactly 1 commander in play just means on the board in any theater, this card has +1 attack and +1 defense. Otherwise, it has -1 attack. So this is an ongoing effect that modifies this card's attack and defense values. There are cards that have an effect type, which is represented by a bolded word in front of the effect. So I'm not going to go through these because these are just listed as keywords in the rulebook and on these reference cards. But for instance, this one has a restriction. It may only be played in the secondary theater. This one has a leader effect. That's an important keyword that I'll tell you right away. The bottom, or typically the last card you played in a theater, in a given theater. So like if the Riverwide player had that in that theater, this card is your leader. So as soon as, like, this card's the leader until I play another card, now this is the leader. These leader effects are they're only active as long as the card is the leader. And so when this card is the leader, or the bottom card in a given column, it gets +3 defense. Okay, let's keep going through these attributes of a card here. That's actually everything for the main part of the card, or the character portion. Well, I guess here's the name, which is less important, and then the card's factions icon. But again, you can just tell by the color as well. Okay, for the location portion, we're only looking at that top left there. There's 2 victory point values, or VP values. There's the lesser VP value, and then right there is the greater VP value. Most of them are either 1 or 2 or 2 or 3. There's some differences there among the different cards. They also have a location name and then the defending factions icon. So this location is affiliated with the Nulgador. So it's as if the Nulgador own this location currently and they're defending it against attack when it becomes one of these theaters. Then there's typically a location effect, and you just do what it says it does. Most of these are just extra options or restrictions or just factors that come into play when that location is active. There's one more important attribute of a location, and that is the location's defense bonus, which is, you can see there's that little shield icon again. This means this location has 1 defense bonus for the Nulgador player. So when you're calculating the results of a battle, you are going to add defense equal to the number of defense bonus icons here for the defending player's faction. You can see some of these, like, look at this location here. This has 2 defending icons for the Riverwide Alliance. So it's you add 2 defense to your total defense in this theater. Okay, so when I play a card, I just leave it out, and I'm going to go ahead and update my strength. So your strength in a theater is kind of a running tally, and strength is just a fancy, it's a different term for net attack, basically. So when you resolve a theater, you're going to take your total attack value from cards and whatever shenanigans you're getting from effects in the theater, minus your opponent's total defense in the theater, including the theater's defense bonus. So right now, my attack in this theater is 3, but you can see that the Riverwide Alliance gets 1 defense bonus from this location. So 3 minus the 1 defense bonus is a net 2 attack, or the other way to say that is I have 2 strength in the theater right now. So I'm going to update my shard to reflect my 2 strength. It's just nice to have a running tally so you don't have to total those up all the time. So indicating here that there's 2 Nulgador strength in the theater to 0, essentially, Riverwide strength in the theater. Yeah, not essentially. There's actually 0 Riverwide strength in this theater, and then we both have 0 in this theater. Okay, so let's just say, as another example, none of these are good examples, so let's just play this card out. So now the Riverwide faction took their turn, and this card adds 1 strength, but since it's the leader, it gets +3 defense. Well, that knocks me down to 0 because I only had a net 2 strength, and that 3 defense further reduces that. So if I'm the Nulgador player, I'm back down to 0, and I have 1 attack here as the Riverwide player. So it's actually 1 strength to 0 strength as our running total for the theater. And if this theater happened to be resolved right now, the Riverwide player would win the theater. Okay, that's playing a card. You don't have to alternate theaters. You can pick whichever theater you want to play into, and you can just play the card. Okay, the other thing you can do is use a card's action. This is a lot more rare, but is on, I think, just a handful of cards. You can see this says free action here. That's not a good example. Some of these cards will just say action. If a card says action and has some text after it, what it means is if the card is in play, you can use your action for the turn, and you can resolve that text effect and do whatever it says. Free actions are actually exactly what they sound like. If this card is in play, I can just take that free action, but you can only do free actions once per turn, and that doesn't count as my action. So I could take that free action, hypothetically, and then still play another card somewhere. Or I could take that free action and then disengage. You're not doing anything. There's no mechanisms in the game right now that have you like play a card from hand and just discard it for its effect. All of these are either restrictions on if and when you can play the card, or they are modifiers or actions that are available to you once the card is in play. So don't think of this as a card game where I'm playing cards from hand just onto the table and haha, I got you with a one-shot effect. That's not how it works. You put cards into play, and then their text is active for you. Okay, that is using a card's action, and then we're going to go back and forth until somebody disengages. Disengaging means playing a card as the next location. So it's called loading the location. So I would take a card from my hand, and instead of taking some other action or playing a card, I'm going to load this as the next location. This is not an active theater. This is just the loaded location. These are the 2 active theaters, primary and secondary. And but this does trigger the start of the end of the conflict phase for this round, because after I play this as the loaded theater for my turn, my opponent has the opportunity to take one final action during this conflict phase. So this is their last turn of this conflict phase. So unlike normal, there's one additional option available to them other than these 3, which is they can pass. You can just decide to do nothing and not take a final turn this conflict phase. But one thing you can, whoops, sorry, dropped my cards there. But you can choose to play a final card, or you can choose to take a final, use a card's action as your final action for the conflict phase. But it comes at a cost. So if you do decide to take this final action during this conflict phase, you have to do what's called exhaust a card, which is put it down in your exhaust row, and then you can do the thing that you want it to do. Typically, this is going to be play another card somewhere. And then after that, the conflict phase ends. So one player disengages by loading a location. The other player has the option for a final turn if they exhaust. And then after that, the conflict phase ends and you move on to the resolution phase. Exhausting, unless it's specified otherwise, exhausting means taking a card from your hand, putting it into your exhaust row. Think of your exhaust row. So like I might end up with, I don't know, 3 or 4 cards in my exhaust row by the end of this. Think of your exhaust row as like a temporary discard pile. We're going to be recruiting cards from each other's exhaust rows, so it's actually a bad thing to have a bunch of cards in your exhaust row most of the time. The Nulgador player has some trickiness where they can build a little bit of an engine for themselves if they have the right cards out, but think of having cards in general in your exhaust row as a bad thing because it opens up your opponent to steal those cards. It gives them more options, and you might get some of your favorite cards stolen by your opponent. Okay, once a player has disengaged and the other player has taken their optional final turn in the conflict phase, then you go ahead and you resolve both theaters. I'm going to just add a couple of more cards out here so we have a little bit more of a board state. Let's pretend this card was out there as well. And there was some amount of strength in each theater. Okay, this is not untypical of what it might look like at the end of the conflict phase. So on this reference card, the resolution phase is on the back. First, you're going to resolve the secondary theater. When you're resolving a theater, first you calculate everybody's total strength, which we have done. It's your total attack in a theater minus your opponent's total defense in a theater. One nuance here is, yes, in the primary location, the defending faction, so the location that the faction that the location belongs to gets to count these defense bonus icons if there are any. That's not true for the secondary location. For the secondary location, the text effect is still in play, but you don't get to count the defense bonus icons. Okay, that's an important nuance that you have to remember. Those defense bonus icons aren't going to be in play until that becomes the primary theater. So first we're going to resolve the secondary theater. We have, let's say, calculated our net strength, and I'm not going to go through the work of calculating it, but let's just say that, oops, blue played on red's column by accident there. Let's just say that the red player won the secondary theater here, because they have the most strength. If you are tied, so if we both have the same amount of strength, or we both have the same amount of net attack in a theater, ties go to the defending faction. So whoever is affiliated with that location wins any ties. So if we both have 3 strength in the theater, then whoever is the defending faction would win that theater. Okay, so the winner of the secondary theater has 2 choices. They can either occupy or enlist. So you notice that the secondary theater is not up for points yet. When it moves over to become the primary theater, it will be available to be claimed for victory points, but for now it's sort of just engine building effects or deck building effects. So red or the Nulgador player won the secondary theater. They can choose to either occupy, which is keep 1 card in the theater. So at the end of this, we're going to end up discarding all cards played to these theaters. Occupying means you get to pick 1 card that you've played in this theater, and you get to keep it when it shifts over to become the primary theater, and it's just there at the start of the next round. You can discover your favorite strategies there, but that can be a really nice way to help yourself have a head start going into a primary theater fight. The other option you can choose is to enlist, which is getting +1 recruitment in the following phase. By default, you're each going to get 1 recruitment. You're each going to get to steal 1 of each other's cards. The winner of the secondary theater, if they choose to enlist, they get to recruit 2 cards instead of 1 during that recruitment phase. So let's say red likes the sound of that. They're going to go ahead and choose to enlist instead of occupy. At this point, you don't do that enlisting. You just have to remember that, okay, that's the option that the winner of the secondary theater went with. So since we've resolved the secondary theater and no one chose to occupy, we're going to go ahead and put these into our exhaust rows, which again is sort of like a temporary discard pile. Think of it like the minor leagues. Things are going to get recruited there by your opponent. So that's the secondary theater resolved. Primary theater, you're going to resolve that next. Okay, this gets a little bit in the weeds, but these rules are here for a reason, because it can reward you for having a decent margin of victory in the primary theater. It rewards you with extra points. So we'll go through what that looks like. So your win margin, that's just an easy concept of the winner's strength minus the loser's strength. So let's just say the river-wide player, the blue player, had 5 strength, so 5 net attack in this theater, and the red player had 1 strength in the theater. So 5 minus the 1, there's a win margin of 4 there. So you find your win margin. If your win margin was 0, 1, 2, or 3, you claim the theater's lesser VP value. So if you recall, the lesser VP value is right here. So in that case, we would take this card, we'd put it into our score pile, and we'd have the 1 VP. If your win margin is 4 or more, you claim the greater VP value. So you'd rotate the card like this to remember that you got this 2 instead of that 1, and then you'd put that in your score pile oriented like that so that you claim those points. If your win margin was, if the battle was uncontested, which means one player had a card in the theater, 1 or more cards, and the other player didn't have any cards in that theater, and the player who had cards in the theater had a strength of at least 1, because it's possible that that location bonus might prevent you from having a net strength of 1 or more. So if you have at least 1 strength in a theater, and you have a card in that theater, and your opponent does not have any cards in that theater, then the battle is considered uncontested, which as the loser you don't want, because that also allows them to gain the greater VP value. And that supersedes this point about the win margin. So even if my win margin was just 1, like let's say 1 strength minus 0 strength because they didn't play any cards into it, since the battle was uncontested, I get to take the greater VP value. Okay, the only other thing about resolving the primary theater is if your win margin was 2 or 3, you gain Protect 1 as the winner of the primary theater, in addition to claiming the theater for its victory points. Protection is you get to choose 1 card. So Protect 1 means 1 card from your exhaust row. You get to discard that card before your opponent recruits cards from your exhaust row in the next phase. However, you're not allowed to you're not allowed to discard cards you're not allowed to use this protection if it would take the number of cards in your exhaust row below your opponent's total recruitment. So let's say I earned Protect 1 as the red player, excuse me, and my opponent had, by default had 1 recruitment. I couldn't discard this 1 card in my recruitment row or my exhaust row because I need to allow them to have their full recruitment if possible. Okay. So let's say that blue won this one and they won by a good margin, so they get that greater VP value. you're going to put it into your score pile, and your score pile is just, you make your own little column of cards in your personal area that is going to end up looking like something like this. And so my running total of victory points, if this was my score pile, is 2, 3, 4. I have 4 victory points at that point. So it's just a way you're going to claim these primary theaters. You're going to take it into your player area, start yourself a score pile somewhere to keep track of those points. So this one we decided was over here because the blue player won that primary theater. And again, remember, the primary theater is up for points. The secondary theater is not up for points. We're not even looking at the loaded theater yet. So we're going to go ahead and put the cards played into that theater into our exhaust rows. So this is the state of things. I've got 2 cards over here in the Nulgador exhaust row, and I've got 3 cards over there in the River Wide exhaust row. Here's our deck, and here's our hands. At this point, we're going to recruit. So we already did this, exhaust all played cards. At this point, you would use Protect 1 if you could, and you had earned it if you won the primary theater. Now each of us is going to recruit 1 card, and remember, you recruit 2 instead if you won the secondary theater and you chose to enlist of your 2 available options. And then after that, we're going to discard our remaining exhausted cards. This is the fun part. It's almost like a little deck building exercise, because as who did we say won that secondary theater? I think red did. So it doesn't really matter who goes first. You can do this simultaneously. Red is going to look through the cards in blue's exhaust row, and we're going to look at the red half. And okay, I like the look of that card. I'm going to put this, and you rotate it to your faction's half, and I'm going to put that in my discard just to save space. I'm going to say my discard pile is tucked underneath my deck there. Okay, any card that I didn't recruit, I got to make sure I leave it on the opposing faction's half, and then those can go ahead and get discarded. So cards from your exhaust row at this point, go ahead and get discarded if they were not recruited. All right. Oh, actually, we said that red had 2 recruitment coming because they enlisted. So they're also going to take, I like that card. I'm going to take that card. Rotate it to the red half, put that in my discard pile. Make sure this stays on blue's half because that stayed with blue. Okay, now blue, remember by default you each get 1 recruitment unless you chose to enlist and you had earned that. Blue is going to recruit 1 from red's exhaust row. So they're going to look at the blue half. Okay, I like the look of this card. I'm going to leave this one to the red player, and I'm going to take this one into my discard as the blue player. So this recruitment is really important because these starting halves are less powerful than the non-starting halves of the cards. So whenever you're recruiting, it's like you're stealing a card from your opponent, but also you're upgrading your own deck because you're getting a more powerful card. And maybe even more important than that, you're unlocking more powerful combos and synergies between the cards, especially depending if you've tried to recruit yourself into those combos and synergies. So recruitment is a very powerful mechanism here for you. So this one, I believe, remained unrecruited from reds, so that's going to go from their exhaust row to their discard pile. And that is the end of the resolution phase. Now we're going to do the cleanup phase. First, we're going to check for victory. If one player has reached 5 victory points this round, that player wins. If multiple people hit 5 victory points this round, then whoever has the most victory points wins. If you're tied, then you look at your score piles and you look at the most recently claimed cards, so basically the bottom of your score pile column, and you start moving yourself upwards and comparing most recently whoever has the highest victory point value card claimed the lowest is going to end up winning that tiebreaker and winning the game. So let's just say here were our 2 score piles like this. So there's blue score pile and there's red score pile. Let's say our bottom cards in our score pile were both 1s. Okay, that's a tie. We move up 1 in the column. Red has a 2 and blue has a 1. That means that red is going to win this because they have that larger victory point value here. And just so there's no confusion, when you're claiming primary theaters, it doesn't have to be your faction's theater, like your faction's affiliation. This, when this is a primary theater, this location is up for grabs. Yes, it maybe originally belonged to the red player and they are going to be able to defend it more easily, but that location is still up for grabs, and so you still claim that as the blue player if you win that location. Okay, after that, we're doing cleanup here. Oh, the other thing you check for, if no one has reached 5 victory points, if there are at least 6 claimed theaters, then you just compare score. So both of those trigger. If someone reached 5 victory points, or if there are at least 6 theaters that have been claimed between the two players, then you go ahead and you score up, and that's the end of the game. Okay, after that, if no one has won the game, we're going to go ahead and each draw to a hand of 5. At this point, if you need to reshuffle your discard pile to form a new deck in order to fill your hand to 5, you would do that now. So let's just say the blue player had no cards left in their hand and they drew their 3 from their deck, but they need to draw more cards, so they're going to go ahead and shuffle up their discard pile, and they just so happen they're going to draw their whole deck at this point. So their whole deck is here in their hand, and they actually don't have a deck any longer, and that could very well happen. It's small, thin card pools that we're working with here, so you might end up in a situation where you have 5 or even fewer than 5. But as long as you can draw at least 3 cards and you have a hand of 3 cards, you're still in the fight and you don't lose to morale. Okay, and it says here, it gives you directions to do that. If you hand of less than 3, then you lose. Okay, then at this point, we're going to slide these locations over, and the former, so remember we claimed the primary location, primary theater. Last round's secondary theater shifts over to become this round's primary theater. Last round's loaded location shifts over and is now this round's secondary theater. And then you just go ahead and start taking turns in the conflict phase again. Remember, the conflicts phase, the person who took the first turn of the first conflict phase of the game is always Nolgador. They're kind of the aggressors in the lore here. But after that, whoever claimed the primary theater last round is going to start and take the first turn this next round. So I can't remember who we had claiming the primary theater last round, but whoever claimed the primary theater last round is going to go ahead and get to take their first turn, the turn first this round. Let's see, one thing I want to make sure that I don't forget to tell you. When you're playing cards during the conflict phase, if you ever are down to, let's say I have all 3 of these cards out and I only have 1 card left in my hand, if on your turn you only have 1 card left in your hand, you have to load that card and disengage with it. You have to load that card as an X location and disengage with it. So don't leave yourself in a pickle. If you need to use a card, don't make sure you use that card instead of saving it until you have just the 1 card left, because you're going to have to load that as the location. Which hand management is going to be important, and I'll leave you to discover the strategies on how to manage your hand and not get stuck in that situation. But that's an important distinction. Someone is always going to have to disengage, even if both players want to delay it. The first person who on their turn has just 1 card in their hand has to disengage using that card. Another thing that I should mention is, let's say blue disengaged, now red has that chance for that final turn in this conflict phase. I only have 1 card in my hand and I want to play it, but I don't have a card to exhaust with, because if you remember, you have to exhaust a card as a cost in order to take that final action in the conflict phase after the other player disengages. If you have, and only in this case, if you have just 1 card left and the other player disengaged, I can go ahead and exhaust the top card of my deck in order to play this card or take another action. Well, if I want to take an action out here, I'd have to exhaust the card in my hand. But if I want to play this card, you are allowed to exhaust the top card of your deck as an action. Also important to note, there are some, very few, but there are some card draw effects in this game from just different situations and location effects and card effects. Other than during the cleanup phase, you actually don't reshuffle your discard. So let's say I have a draw 3 effect and I'm the red player and I draw these two. I have this discard pile here. If you're used to other deck builders, you're probably thinking, oh, I'll just shuffle up my discard pile right away and then turn it into a new deck and keep drawing. You don't do that unless it's the cleanup phase. So if you're in the conflict phase and you're playing cards and you've got some things going on that allow you to draw cards, you can only draw cards so long as you have deck left. If you run into your discard pile, you don't shuffle out that discard pile until the conflict phase is over, we've done resolution, we're in the cleanup phase, and it's time to draw your next hand. That is when you go ahead and shuffle up your discard pile. Okay. So we've gone through that. You actually know all the rules except for one interesting circumstance that could happen, which is called the final battle. So not every game is going to have a final battle, but in some games that you play, there's going to be circumstances that lead one round of the game to be the final battle, and the final battle is always the last round of the game. So things that can trigger the final battle, at the start of a round, you check to see if any player has exactly 4 victory points. If they do, that makes this round the final battle. Or B, if there are exactly 5 claimed locations between the two players. So, this player has 3, this player has 2. Okay, that triggers it, and this round is the final battle. If either of those conditions are true, this is the last round of the game, and it has special rules because it's the final battle. And I've said that phrase so much already that I'm getting tired of the word. Okay, but the way the final battle works is it plays the same as any other round. You're still going to be competing over these 2 locations, except the secondary location is now up for grabs in terms of victory points in addition to the primary location under the same rule set. So the same rules that govern the primary location in terms of whether you take the lesser or greater VP value also now govern the secondary location, and both of these cards are going to end up getting claimed if it's the final battle. And remember, otherwise the secondary theater doesn't get claimed, only the primary theater gets claimed. But in the final round or in the final battle situation, both cards are going to get claimed. You can't disengage, which it doesn't make sense to anyway because it's the last round of the game. But you're not allowed to disengage. So, if you only have 1 card left, you can just play that card. You don't have to disengage with that card. Let's see, other things you can kind of not worry about effects that, like the secondary theater resolution effects of enlist or, what's the other one? Enlist or occupy. Those don't matter because it's the last round of the game. So don't worry about that. You're only resolving this for the points. Let's see, what else? As normal, even though this one is up for points, you don't count the secondary theater's defense bonus. And so that still holds true, but you still are fighting over it. And the player who, as normal, the player who is defending the location wins ties on that location. So, you know what? I think that's it. I think I taught you everything. I'm just trying to take one last second to think about it because I want to make sure you can learn from the video. No, I think that should do it. So thank you guys for watching. Thanks for following this project, and I hope you check out the game.